Good morning, Team Alabama. We are going to continue reading today in the Lottery Rose. We are on page 9, starting about midway down the page. His joy in looking at a page of full-blown roses in his book was brought to a sudden end when Miss Cressman stopped at his desk to scold him for not attempting to do the assigned pages in his workbook. He stared at her for a second as if he did not recognize her, and then giving up his dream of peaceful gardens full of roses, he opened the reading workbook on his desk. "You haven't tried, Georgie. You never try," Miss Cressman said, and she pointed to a line of 4 pictures: a tree, a turtle, a train, and a thimble. "Say the names with these pictures, Georgie. Repeat them after me," she ordered. And when he obeyed, she said, "Now, place an X under the pictures that begin with the same sound." Georgie looked at her and then turned toward the window. Outside, the sky was blue, and if there were any flowers out there, they would be turning their faces up to look at the blue sky. And it didn't make any difference so far as he could see whether the names of any pictures began with the same sound. Miss Cressman was watching him. "Think, Georgie." Her voice began to grow shrill. "Which pictures should have an X placed under them? Now do a little thinking and get to work." She walked down the aisle a short distance from him, and Georgie seized the crayon on his desk. "Here are all your X's, Miss Cressman," he said to himself, and he made a heavy, angry X under every picture on the page. When Miss Cressman came back to his desk a few minutes later, she picked up his book and, after a glance, tore his worksheet into shreds and crumpled them into a tight ball. And then she and Georgie glared at one another until somehow Georgie was the winner. Because Miss Cressman finally looked away from him and seemed to study her hands before going back to her desk. Her hands were white with long, rosy nails that looked, Georgie thought, as if they would like to scratch a boy who couldn't read a single word. The long nails pointed out to him, and Georgie often thought of ways in which the long, rosy nail might suddenly be broken. When the bell rang for noon intermission, and you could add intermission as your vocab word, intermission or break, he hurriedly got off the school ground and into the alley back of the building where he lived. Excuse me. Page 11. There he kicked over a half a dozen garbage cans and yelled back to a woman who came out on one of the balconies and threatened to have the police come and haul Georgie off to jail. He shrugged at the women's threats, but he kicked no more cans and slowly made his way down to the apartment where he lived. At the entrance, he was no longer the impudent boy who had glared at Miss Cressman or yelled back at the woman in the alley. He was suddenly worried and frightened, like a little animal that senses a return of danger. Okay, on page 11, there are a couple of vocab words that you could add. You could add impudent and worry and frightened. You probably don't need to add frightened, but worry, like scared, timid looking. The beating that he had taken from Steve the week before had been very close to a killing. Another one might be more than he could endure, but the beating had resulted in one good, since it caused Steve to run away from the apartment. Georgie's screams had aroused some of the neighbors enough to make them yell at Steve, threatening as the woman on the balcony had threatened Georgie to call the police. Steve, however, did not shrug at the threat, and it was now 6 days since he had shown up at the apartment. There was always the dread, or the fear, however, that Steve might have returned while Georgie was in school, and so it was necessary to climb the steps stealthily. Okay, stealthily might be another word that you would want to add. Quietly, a little timid. He's not climbing it, banging up the steps. He's kind of like inching his way up the steps. And to listen at the door for a while before he turned the knob. The door was usually left open since Steve lost his key and had forbidden Georgie's mother to lock the door in case he arrived some night without notice. Standing at the half-open door, Georgie could hear no sound except his mother's heavy breathing as she lay asleep on the living room sofa. It seemed that she was alone until Georgie could not be certain, and he tiptoed inside fearfully, peeping around the corners into all the rooms and finally the screened porch at the back where his bed was kept. There was no sign of Steve, and Georgie had a feeling of weakness that came with his relief. Coming into the living room again, he looked at his mother where she lay with her mouth open, one hand on the half-emptied glass which she had set on the floor beside her. She wore a tattered bathrobe. Tattered is a word that we could add to our vocab also. That's torn up. It's like in shreds, tattered. Tattered bathrobe, which was stained with coffee and burned in places where she had dropped a lighted cigarette. Her hair was uncombed, and the sickness which came of too much drinking made the small, hot apartment a vile-smelling place that Georgie hated. Okay, talk to me a little bit about his mom. Okay, what do you know about Mom? What are some facts you can put down about Mom? She's probably a drunk, and she drinks too much till she pukes because that apartment smells like puke. Okay, and she drinks and then smokes cigarettes, and she lays on the couch most of the day till she gets drunk and passes out, it sounds like. So add some of those facts. Talk to me, put your own ideas about Georgie in there, Georgie's mom, and things that you know about Georgie. Do you think Georgie likes his mom? Okay. He thought suddenly and wistfully of the pictures in his flower book, the quiet places and the cool, sweet smells that he was sure would be there. He hesitated to wake his mother. Sometimes when she was not worried about her supply of whiskey, she went into one of her crying spells and put on an act of loving him. At such times she insisted upon kissing Georgie, hurting his raw back with a grip that grew tighter as he tried to free himself. It was necessary, though, to wake her and to ask for food. He hadn't had breakfast, and she had been too far along with her drinking the night before to cook supper for him. He had found some cold cuts and dry bread on the kitchen counter last night that had comforted his empty stomach for a while, but now there was nothing else to eat in the kitchen. Her waking was much as he had feared it would be. She rolled over on her side, pulling him to her, weeping noisily as she ran her hand across the cuts on his back while she declared that Steve would never be allowed inside the apartment again and that he would never have another chance to hurt her boy. She seemed to forget the times that she had joined Steve in torturing him and had sat with a drink in her hand, not caring whether Georgie lived through the beating that Steve was giving him or not. Georgie never hated her so much as he did on these occasions when she kissed and cried over him. Okay, write some facts about how Georgie feels about his mom. He hates when she kisses him. She allows Steve to beat him. You are an old liar, he thought bitterly. But he did not speak up. He needed the food, and she was his only hope. Rennie Burgess continued her blubbering. Blubbering on your vocab on page 13 means crying, her weeping. Promises to Georgie even after he pulled himself away from her. If that brute ever comes back, if he ever dares to show his ugly face here again, Georgie, we'll call the police and have him pulled off to jail. There'll be just Mama and her little boy here, just the two of us together. How we'll be able to live, I don't know, but we'll manage somehow. Mama will have a new lock put on the front door, and her boy won't ever need to be afraid again. We'll find some way to live without ever taking another cent from Steve. She stopped at those words and looked thoughtfully at the bottle beside the sofa. A shamed feeling built up inside Georgie as he looked at her. No other kid in Tampa, he supposed, had a mother like this one. He wished that he was big enough to run away and never see her again. Are we going to have something to eat? He asked finally when his mother gave him a chance to speak. She groaned and swayed slightly, and then she got to her feet. Poor Mama's not well enough, Georgie, she told him. Mama's not up to cooking much. She pulled aside her pillow and took out a purse from which she shook a few bills and coins upon the sofa. Picking up a dollar bill, she put it into Georgie's hands. Here, my little love. Here's the last of Mama's money to buy something for her boy at the grocery. A can of pork and beans, maybe. Wouldn't that be good? Hurry now, and if Mama has the strength, she'll go out to the kitchen and make coffee. Watch the change, Georgie. There'll be little enough, but watch it, and bring every cent home to Mama." Georgie ran out of the apartment, rubbing his mouth to rid it of the moisture left by her kisses. The grocery store was only 2 blocks away, and a run-down place that for months had smelled unpleasantly of rotting vegetables and general filth. Okay, filth means just extreme trashiness or dirt, general filth. Lately, however, the store had undergone a thorough scrubbing and painting, which gave it the look of an entirely different place. There was a new air of friendliness, too, under a changed management, and the lines of customers at the checking counter were longer than they had been in many months. Georgie noticed that instead of the smell of vegetables rotting in the bins along the wall, there was a whiff of fresh paint when he stepped inside, and that the neat piles of lettuce and cauliflower and oranges looked clean and ready to eat. The new manager was all smiles, telling ladies, "Goodbye, ma'am. Y'all have a nice day now." He even had a friendly "Hello there, little boy" for Georgie, who hardly ever bought anything more than a loaf of bread or a can of beans. Georgie, however, made no reply to the manager's friendly greeting. Instead, he glowered and scuttled down another aisle out of the man's sight. Okay, we're going to add those 2 words at the bottom of page 15 to your vocab. Glowered and scuttled down the aisle. Those 2 words, add those, please. Actually, the manager had a rather mild-looking face, but he was tall and dark, and his height, his age, and his dark complexion were for Georgie too much like Steve for comfort. The man's smiling words were lies, he was sure, lies like his mother's kisses, and her calling Georgie little love. He hated this man who made him think of Steve, and he ran fearfully down the aisles looking back to see that the manager was not following him. At the canned goods section, he found the beans that he was looking for without difficulty and took them across the store to the lane where Mrs. Sims stood at her checkers station. Mrs. Sims lived somewhere in Georgie's block, and she was always kind. She asked too many questions, all of which Georgie refused to answer, but he admitted to himself that Mrs. Sims was nice. Once she had taken him to a movie for children at Christmas time, and Georgie never forgot the wonder of it. She smiled at him that morning when he came up to her station. "How are you, Georgie?" she asked, and he ducked his head slightly to indicate that he was all right. She looked at him thoughtfully for a time, and Georgie knew that she was wondering about the latest cuts and bruises on his face. She didn't ask about them, though, and he was glad of that. She rang up the cost of the pork and beans and handed him his change, and then she tore a small piece of cardboard from a big roll beside the cash register and gave it to him. "Look, Georgie, can you read numbers?" she asked. He could. In fact, he could add and subtract a little. It was just being dumb and reading that made Miss Cressman angry with him. That and setting a fire under her car, and smelling bad because his mother never washed his clothes or said anything about taking a bath. But numbers, yes. If he could have been as good in everything else as he was in numbers, Miss Cressman might have smiled at him the way she did at the smart kids. He was immediately interested in the row of numbers on the card, and Mrs. Sims had given to him. "I can say 'em easy, all of 'em," he said, and there was just a suggestion of a smile on his lips when he looked up at her. "Well then, let me tell you about these numbers." She took Georgie's hands and held it in both of hers. "You see, the new manager is holding what we call a lottery next Saturday morning. If you're here at 10 o'clock, you'll see him draw cards from the big kettle by the door. If one of the cards should happen to have the same numbers as the ones on this card I've given you, you could win a prize. How about that, Georgie?" His face lighted up with a sudden eagerness, and Miss Sims' face took on a worried look almost immediately. "Now, don't expect too much, Georgie. There are hundreds, maybe 1,000 of these cards, and only a few people can be lucky. You may not win anything this time, but take the card anyway and be here Saturday morning." Privately, she made up her mind that there would at least be a candy bar in her pocket for him. Okay, let's add to our facts. What are some new things that we know? Georgie has to go to the grocery store on his own to get food. Mom usually drinks and doesn't fix anything for him. When he goes to the grocery store this time, he notices that the grocery's been cleaned up, that it used to be pretty filthy, and now it's clean and has new management. And there's a nice lady at the grocery store. Do we remember what her name is? Miss Sims. Okay, she's the checker at the grocery. And she gives him a card or a lottery ticket and a chance to win something. And he needs to come back on Saturday to see if he's the winner. Okay, what are some questions you have? Does Mom ever protect him? Does Steve come back? What happens to Georgie? Does Georgie win anything? Okay, ask some questions. What questions do you want to know? What do you think is going to happen? Okay, and you should have some new vocab words. There may be a couple that we didn't do the definitions. You can look those up and add those. But that is all for today, Team Alabama. See you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.